The Douglas DC-6 sat on the tarmac at Newark International Airport just after midnight on March 14, 1986, its four propellers spinning in the cold spring air. The aircraft belonged to Sentinel Air Cargo, a mid-sized freight company that specialized in high-value shipments for financial institutions. Tonight's cargo was routine for Sentinel, $7.3 million in unmarked bills, sealed in reinforced aluminum containers, destined for the Federal Reserve Bank in Chicago. The money was part of a scheduled currency redistribution, the kind of transfer that happened dozens of times each week across the country without incident. Captain Richard Holbrook, a 22-year veteran with an impeccable safety record, performed his pre-flight inspection with the same methodical precision he'd demonstrated on thousands of previous flights. His co-pilot, James Morrow, was newer to the company but came highly recommended from his previous employer. The two men moved through their checklist in the cockpit, their voices steady and professional over the radio as they communicated with the tower. At 12:47 a.m., the tower cleared Sentinel Flight 227 for takeoff. The plane lifted smoothly into the darkness, banking west over the industrial landscape of northern New Jersey. Everything appeared normal. The last communication from Flight 227 came at 1:23 a.m., 36 minutes after takeoff. Captain Holbrook's voice crackled over the radio, confirming the aircraft's position over central Pennsylvania at an altitude of 11,000 feet. Sentinel 227, maintaining heading 270, all systems nominal, he reported to Air Traffic Control in Harrisburg. The controller acknowledged and provided a routine weather update: clear skies, light winds, excellent visibility. Holbrook confirmed receipt of the information. His tone was unhurried, almost bored, the sound of a man performing a task he'd performed countless times before. Then silence. When the controller attempted to raise Flight 227 for a scheduled check-in 17 minutes later, there was no response. Multiple attempts followed over the next hour, each met with static. At 2:58 a.m., when the plane failed to arrive at its scheduled Chicago destination, the Federal Aviation Administration initiated emergency protocols. By dawn, a massive search operation was underway, coordinated between the FAA, the FBI, and state police across Pennsylvania, Ohio, and Indiana. The investigation consumed the resources of multiple federal agencies. FBI Special Agent Victoria Chen, assigned to the Bureau's White-Collar Crime Division, arrived at Sentinel Air Cargo's headquarters in Newark on the morning of March 15. She was methodical by nature, a former accountant who joined the Bureau specifically because she enjoyed untangling complex financial crimes. This case, however, presented a unique challenge: the crime scene had vanished into thin air. Chen and her team interviewed everyone connected to Flight 227. The ground crew who loaded the cargo confirmed the aluminum containers had been properly secured and sealed with tamper-evident locks. The Sentinel employees who prepared the manifest all vouched for standard procedures. Background checks on Captain Holbrook revealed nothing suspicious: a divorced father of two, financially stable, no debts, no criminal record, no unusual behavior in the weeks before the flight. Co-pilot Morrow was similarly unremarkable, though Chen noted he'd only been with Sentinel for 4 months. Meanwhile, search teams scoured potential crash sites. Helicopters swept forests and farmland. State police checked every airfield, private landing strip, and abandoned runway within a 500-mile radius. The Coast Guard even searched portions of Lake Erie on the slim chance the plane had deviated north. Not a single piece of wreckage turned up. No oil slicks, no debris fields, no scorched earth. It was as if the Douglas DC-6 and its cargo had simply ceased to exist. By the second week, Agent Chen began to suspect this wasn't an accident. Crashes left evidence, always. She requested detailed analysis of the flight plan and discovered something interesting. The route Captain Holbrook filed would have taken the aircraft directly over a particularly remote section of the Allegheny Mountains, an area with minimal radar coverage in 1986. The plane could have descended below radar detection for several minutes without immediately raising alarms. She also learned that Holbrook had logged unusual flight hours in the month before the disappearance, multiple trips in small private aircraft to rural Pennsylvania airfields, ostensibly visiting a sick relative. Chen requested phone records. In the weeks before March 14, Captain Holbrook had made several calls to a number registered to a storage facility in Scranton. When investigators visited the location, they found the unit had been rented under a false name and emptied days before the flight. The manager remembered only that the renter had paid in cash and kept irregular hours. The security camera footage had already been recorded over. Standard practice at the time was to reuse tapes every 2 weeks. The trail went cold. The media coverage intensified. Newspapers ran daily updates with increasingly speculative theories. Some suggested mechanical failure and claimed the wreckage simply hadn't been found yet in the dense forests. Others proposed hijacking, though no ransom demands ever materialized. A few outlets entertained conspiracy theories involving organized crime or even foreign governments. The story had everything: mystery, money, and the tantalizing possibility of the perfect crime. But as weeks turned to months with no breaks in the case, public interest gradually waned. Agent Chen continued working the investigation, but with no physical evidence and no witnesses, she had little to pursue. The insurance companies paid out on the lost currency. Sentinel Air Cargo survived the scandal but never recovered its reputation, eventually selling to a larger competitor. The families of Captain Holbrook and James Morrow were left in limbo, no bodies to bury, no closure, no answers. In 1988, after 2 years of investigation, the FBI officially suspended active work on the case, though it remained technically open. The file gathered dust for decades. Occasionally, a journalist would revisit the story on a slow news day, or an amateur investigator would propose a new theory on an internet forum. None led anywhere. Agent Chen, who'd become somewhat obsessed with the case, retired from the bureau in 2003 without ever solving it. She kept a copy of the case file in her home office, occasionally reviewing it, still searching for the details she'd missed. The disappearance of Sentinel Flight 227 became one of those unsolved mysteries that aviation enthusiasts discussed at conferences, a cautionary tale about the limitations of 1980s technology and the vulnerabilities in the system for transporting large amounts of cash. The Douglas DC-6 itself became almost mythical, a ghost plane that had slipped through the cracks of modern surveillance. In 2019, 33 years after the disappearance, the National Transportation Safety Board received an unexpected call. A property developer in rural Pennsylvania had purchased 180 acres of forested land near the small town of Emporium, intending to build a luxury camping resort. During initial surveys, his crew discovered what appeared to be aircraft debris in a deep ravine, concealed by decades of forest growth. The NTSB dispatched investigator Marcus Webb, a specialist in historical aviation accidents. What Webb found surprised him, not because it was there, but because of where it was. The wreckage was scattered across a narrow valley, approximately 40 miles south of the original flight path and in an area that had been searched in 1986, though apparently not thoroughly enough. The ravine was particularly treacherous, accessible only by hiking through dense underbrush. The fuselage had broken into 3 main sections, partially buried under soil and vegetation. Webb's team carefully excavated and documented everything. They confirmed the aircraft's registration number matched Sentinel Flight 227. The condition of the wreckage told a story. Webb noted the damage patterns were inconsistent with catastrophic mechanical failure. The engines showed no evidence of fire or explosion. The landing gear was retracted, suggesting controlled flight until the end. Most tellingly, the impact angle indicated a deliberate, controlled descent into the ravine rather than an out-of-control crash. Someone had flown this plane into the ground on purpose, or tried to land it in an impossible location. Inside the cargo hold, Webb's team found the aluminum containers that had held the $7.3 million. All had been opened. All were empty. The tamper-evident seals had been cut with precision, likely with bolt cutters. There was no sign of the money itself, and no remains of Captain Holbrook or James Morrow. Webb found this absence notable. In a crash of this nature, even after 33 years, they should have found something. Bones don't simply vanish. The NTSB brought in forensic specialists and FBI investigators, including a now-retired Victoria Chen, who flew to Pennsylvania at her own expense to see the site. She stood in the ravine on a cold November morning, looking at the wreckage of the plane that had haunted her career. The team worked for weeks, sifting through debris, looking for clues. They found luggage belonging to both pilots, but it appeared to have been packed as if for a brief trip, too sparse for men who thought they were going to die. In the cockpit, investigators found the flight recorder, though it had been deliberately damaged. The recording was incomplete, but what remained was intriguing. The last audible exchange between Holbrook and Morrow came approximately 43 minutes after takeoff. Their voices were calm, almost cheerful. Holbrook could be heard saying, "Coming up on the marker now. You see it?" Morrow responded, "Visual confirmation. Looks perfect." Then Holbrook, "Okay, let's take her down." The recording ended shortly after. The marker reference troubled the investigators. It suggested pre-planning, a predetermined landing site. But where? Webb's team expanded their search radius from the crash site. Using historical satellite imagery and topographical maps, they identified several possible locations, remote clearings or abandoned fields where a skilled pilot might attempt an emergency landing. The third site they checked, approximately 8 miles northwest of the ravine, proved interesting. It was a long-abandoned private airstrip, built in the 1950s by a timber company and in use since the late 1970s. The strip was overgrown but still visible from the air. Webb walked its length. He found no direct evidence of a 1986 landing, but the location made sense. A pilot could set down here, away from prying eyes, protected by the surrounding forest. With help, you could unload cargo containers quickly. With planning, you could have vehicles waiting. Chen stood with Webb at the abandoned airstrip, trying to piece it together. "They land here in the middle of the night," she said, thinking aloud. "Unload the money, that's what, maybe 30 minutes with 2 people and a vehicle. Then what? Take off again and deliberately crash the plane?" Webb nodded slowly. "That's the only explanation that fits the evidence. They needed the plane to disappear in a way that looked like an accident. Can't just abandon it at an airstrip, someone would find it within days. But if it crashes in a remote ravine, and there's no distress call beforehand, it looks like sudden mechanical failure or pilot error. Search teams focus on the presumed flight path, not 40 miles south." Chen considered this. But they needed to get away from the crash. "That ravine is brutal terrain." "Which means they planned for that too," Webb said. "Parachutes, probably. Jump before impact, let the plane crash on autopilot." "That's incredibly risky," Chen pointed out. "Night jump over unfamiliar terrain." "So is stealing $7 million, Webb replied. The investigation took a new direction. Investigators looked for any evidence of parachutes or survival gear in the ravine area. They combed through old police reports from March 1986, looking for anything unusual, stolen vehicles, suspicious persons, unexplained activity. They found nothing definitive, but they did uncover an interesting detail. 3 days after the plane's disappearance, a hiker had reported finding a torn parachute tangled in trees about 6 miles from the crash site. At the time, with no known connection to any missing aircraft, the local sheriff had filed a report but taken no further action. The parachute itself had been disposed of years ago. Chen reviewed the background checks on both pilots with fresh eyes. Captain Holbrook remained stubbornly clean, almost too clean, she thought. But Morrow was different. His employment history before Sentinel showed a pattern of short stints with various cargo companies, never more than 6 months in one place. His references, when Chen tracked them down decades later, were vague. One former employer told her that Morrow had been competent but odd, someone who asked a lot of questions about cargo manifests and security procedures. The most compelling evidence came from the wreckage itself. In the crushed cockpit, beneath years of debris and decay, Webb's team found a small metal box wedged under the co-pilot seat. The box was fireproof, waterproof, and locked. When opened, it contained a single item, a postcard. The postcard showed a generic beach scene, the kind sold in tourist shops everywhere. There was no writing on it, no message, no address. Just a photograph of white sand, blue water, and palm trees. But the back of the postcard had been marked with a single handwritten notation, paid in full. The handwriting analysis was inconclusive, they had no confirmed samples from Morrow to compare against, and Holbrook's known handwriting was too limited for a definitive match. But someone had placed that postcard in that box and hidden it in the cockpit. Someone who knew the plane would eventually be found and wanted to leave a message. Victoria Chen held the postcard in her gloved hands, studying it under the harsh lights of the FBI laboratory. Paid in full, she repeated. Payment for what? The planning? The risk? Webb stood beside her. Or maybe it's simpler than that. Maybe it's just a taunt. We got away with it. Case closed. Chen didn't think so. The placement was too deliberate, too careful. This wasn't arrogance, it was communication. Someone wanted future investigators to know this had been intentional, planned, successful. But who was the message for? The FBI? The insurance companies? Or perhaps the partners themselves, a confirmation that the deal had been honored. We need to find James Morrow, Chen said, though she knew it was likely hopeless. A man who'd pulled off something this sophisticated wouldn't make the mistake of living under his real name. The investigation continued for another year. Interpol was notified, in case Morrow or Holbrook had fled the country. Banks were asked to flag any unusual cash deposits or currency exchanges from the spring of 1986, a futile task given the volume of such transactions and the decades that had passed. The FBI ran advanced facial recognition software on international databases, looking for matches to both men's photographs. Nothing. Digital forensics experts examined Holbrook's personal computer, salvaged from his home and preserved in evidence storage. The technology was primitive by modern standards, an early IBM PC with a 10-megabyte hard drive. They found nothing incriminating, but they did find gaps in the file dates, suggesting someone had deleted data shortly before the flight. What had been erased? Flight plans? Communications? Financial records? There was no way to recover it. The media discovered the new developments and the story exploded across news channels and podcasts. Suddenly, everyone had a theory. Armchair detectives dissected every detail on social media. True crime forums ran lengthy threads analyzing the evidence. Several people came forward claiming to have information, though none of it proved credible, mostly attention seekers or confused individuals misremembering events from decades past. One man insisted he'd seen Captain Holbrook at a beach bar in Costa Rica in 1989. Another woman claimed James Morrow had been her neighbor in Oregon in the 1990s, though the man she described bore no resemblance to Morrow's photographs. The noise made investigation more difficult, not easier. Chen gave a single interview to a reputable documentary producer, hoping to generate legitimate leads. She chose her words carefully, releasing only information that was already public record. When asked if she believed Holbrook and Morrow were still alive, she paused. "I believe they executed an extremely sophisticated plan," she finally said. "Whether they survived it is another question." The documentary aired in 2021 and was viewed by millions. Tips flooded in, overwhelming the FBI's dedicated hotline. 99% were useless, but the Bureau was obligated to check each one. One tip, however, stood out. A woman in Arizona contacted investigators claiming her late husband had worked as a mechanic for a small cargo company in 1986. She said he'd come home one evening in March of that year acting strangely, counting a large amount of cash he claimed was a bonus. She'd always suspected something was wrong but had been too afraid to ask. When investigators checked the company records, they discovered the mechanic, deceased since 2015, had worked briefly for a subcontractor that performed maintenance on Sentinel Air cargo aircraft. His bank records from 1986 showed a cash deposit of $15,000 on March 17, 3 days after the plane's disappearance. It wasn't proof of involvement, but it suggested the possibility of an accomplice, someone who'd helped with the pre-flight preparation or provided false maintenance records. This discovery opened another angle. If there had been a ground-based accomplice, there might have been others, people who'd helped arrange the landing site, transported the money, provided false identification documents. Each person would have been a potential weak link in the plan, which suggested either exceptional trust or exceptional leverage. Chen developed a new theory. She believed Holbrook and Morrow hadn't acted alone but had been part of a small, carefully selected team. Perhaps 3 or 4 people total, each with specific skills and each with something to gain. The mechanic had been paid off, a relatively small amount for his silence and cooperation. But the pilots, they would have taken the lion's share, splitting perhaps $6 million between them after paying expenses and accomplices. It was enough to disappear, to build a new life in a country without extradition treaties, to live comfortably but not ostentatiously. The NTSB officially closed their investigation in December 2021, concluding that Sentinel Flight 227 had been deliberately crashed as part of an elaborate theft. Their report was thorough, professional, and ultimately unsatisfying. Marcus Webb had done everything possible, but the hard truth was that too much time had passed. Evidence had degraded, witnesses had died, trails had gone cold. The FBI kept the case open, as they did with all unsolved major crimes, but Chen knew no one was actively working it. She was 71 years old now, long retired, yet she still thought about it constantly. She'd created a wall in her home office dedicated to the case, maps, photographs, timelines, all connected by colored string like something from a detective movie. Her wife joked that she'd become Captain Ahab, hunting her white whale. Chen didn't disagree. In her analysis, Chen kept returning to Captain Richard Holbrook. By all accounts, he'd been unremarkable, a good pilot, a decent father, a man who paid his bills on time. Nothing about his background suggested criminal inclination. Yet the sophistication of this crime indicated years of planning, detailed knowledge of aviation systems and federal procedures, and ice-cold nerve. How does an ordinary man become capable of something extraordinary? Chen thought she knew. She'd seen it before in other cases, the slow accumulation of small resentments, the gradual rationalization, the moment when someone decides the rules don't apply to them. Holbrook had been divorced, his ex-wife had remarried someone wealthier. His children were grown and distant. He'd spent 2 decades flying other people's valuable cargo and watching armed guards handle millions in cash. Maybe one day he'd simply thought, why not me? James Morrow remained more mysterious. His background check, even the enhanced versions run with modern databases, revealed remarkably little. He seemed to have materialized in his early 20s with minimal history. Chen suspected James Morrow might itself have been an assumed identity, though proving that decades later was nearly impossible. If Morrow had been using a false identity from the start, it suggested a level of premeditation that went back years. Perhaps he'd been recruited specifically for this job, or perhaps he'd been searching for the right opportunity and the right partner. Either way, the man had skills, not just aviation, but planning, patience, and the ability to maintain a false identity for months while building trust with Holbrook and the company. The beach postcard haunted Chen. She'd had it analyzed by every expert she could find. The paper was common, available in thousands of stores. The image was stock photography, not a specific location. The handwriting was steady, unhurried, suggesting it had been written long before the flight, perhaps as part of the final preparation. Paid in full. She'd considered every interpretation. Was it a message between partners, confirming the plan was complete? A note to themselves, a reminder that they'd earned this? Or something else entirely, perhaps a reference to a debt, real or metaphorical, that the crime had settled? Without context, the words were just words, pregnant with possible meaning but offering no definitive answers. In 2023, 37 years after the disappearance, Chen received an unexpected package at her home. There was no return address, and the postmark was smudged, illegible. Inside was a single item, a photograph. The photo showed two elderly men sitting at an outdoor cafe, drinks in hand, smiling at the camera. Both wore sunglasses and casual tropical clothing. The image quality was poor, clearly taken from a distance with a cheap camera or phone. Neither man was clearly identifiable, their features obscured by age, sunglasses, and the photograph's low resolution. But there was something about the body language, the way one man gestured while the other listened, that made Chen's breath catch. She brought the photograph to the FBI laboratory. Facial recognition software was inconclusive, the resolution was too poor, the angles were wrong, the men too aged from the 1986 photographs. But one analyst thought the man on the left might be consistent with a 70-year-old Richard Holbrook. The other could be anyone. Chen studied the background of the photograph for clues. The cafe appeared to be in a tropical location, she could see palm trees and a glimpse of blue water. Several people in the background wore what looked like resort casual wear. One visible sign on a building was in Portuguese, suggesting Brazil or Portugal. But these details were so generic they could apply to dozens of locations across the globe. She considered the meaning of the photograph. If it was authentic, and that was a significant if, someone had taken it and sent it to her specifically. Someone who knew her address, knew she'd worked the case, and wanted her to see it. Was it mockery? A taunt from someone who'd gotten away with the perfect crime? Or was it something else, perhaps an admission, a confession of sorts, from someone who wanted at least one person to know the truth? The FBI officially classified the photograph as provenance unknown and declined to reopen active investigation based on such ambiguous evidence. Chen understood the decision but disagreed with it. She spent weeks researching expatriate communities in tropical locations, places where Americans might retire and live comfortably on stolen money. Brazil made sense, no extradition treaty with the United States for its own citizens, and in 1986, even looser enforcement of such agreements. Large enough to disappear into, developed enough to live well, but not so expensive that $7 million wouldn't last a lifetime if managed carefully. She booked a flight to Rio de Janeiro with her own money, against her wife's gentle protests. For 2 weeks, she visited American expatriate communities, showing the photograph to anyone who would look. Most people were polite but unhelpful. A few thought the men looked vaguely familiar but couldn't place them. One elderly bartender at a beachside resort studied the photo for a long time before saying, "Maybe I've seen them. But you know, people come and go. And people here, they don't ask questions." Chen returned home without any solid leads, but she hadn't expected any. The trip had been for her own peace of mind, a final attempt to chase the ghost that had defined her career. She was 73 now, and she could feel her health declining. There wouldn't be many more trips, many more investigations. She thought about writing a book about the case, but what would be the point? She didn't have an ending. The last chapter was still unwritten, and unless one of the perpetrators decided to confess, which seemed unlikely after maintaining silence for nearly 4 decades, it would remain unwritten. She placed the photograph in her case file, next to the beach postcard. 2 artifacts, 2 mysteries, connected by an invisible line of money and time. On quiet evenings, Chen would sit in her office and review the case file, even though she knew every detail by heart. She thought about the mechanics of what Holbrook and Morrow had accomplished. They'd identified a vulnerability in the system, the combination of old aircraft, limited radar coverage, and insufficient security protocols for cash transport. They'd exploited it perfectly, timing their move precisely, covering their tracks meticulously. They'd understood that the key wasn't just executing the crime but disappearing afterward, making themselves ghosts. And they'd succeeded where so many others had failed. No bodies meant no closure. No witnesses meant no prosecution. No recovered money meant no leverage for negotiation. They'd thought of everything. But Chen also thought about the cost. Even if Holbrook and Morrow had escaped and built new lives somewhere, they'd left their old lives completely behind. Holbrook had children. Did he ever try to contact them? Did he watch them grow up from a distance, following their lives through whatever limited means he could manage without exposing himself? Or had he made peace with never seeing them again, accepted that as the price of his freedom? And what about Morrow, whoever he really was? Had he built genuine relationships in his new life, or was he forever trapped in another false identity, unable to let anyone know his real history? The perfect crime had a human cost, Chen knew, even for those who succeeded. The case of Sentinel Flight 227 remains officially unsolved. The $7.3 million has never been recovered. No charges have ever been filed. The insurance payout was made decades ago. Sentinel Air Cargo no longer exists. The families of both pilots have moved on with their lives, though Holbrook's daughter occasionally gives interviews on true crime podcasts, still insisting her father was a victim rather than a perpetrator. The wreckage of the Douglas DC-6 has been removed from the ravine and sits in a secure facility, tagged and catalogued, waiting for technology or information that might extract new evidence from its corroded components. The beach postcard remains in the FBI's evidence storage, sealed in plastic, its message as cryptic today as it was when first discovered. Victoria Chen passed away in January 2025, at age 74, from complications related to pneumonia. Her obituary in the New York Times mentioned her distinguished career with the FBI and specifically noted her work on the infamous Sentinel Air Cargo case, calling it one of the most sophisticated unsolved thefts in American aviation history. At her memorial service, several former colleagues spoke about her dedication, her intelligence, and her refusal to give up on cases that others considered hopeless. Her wife donated her case files to the FBI's historical archives, where they remain available to future investigators who might find something Chen missed. The wall in her home office, covered with maps and photographs and theories, was dismantled and stored in boxes. It seemed too personal to display, too much like exhibiting someone's obsession. In the months after Chen's death, her wife was sorting through papers when she found a sealed envelope marked, "To be opened if I die without solving it." Inside was a handwritten letter, Chen's final thoughts on the case. The letter was rambling, mixing professional analysis with personal reflection, but certain passages stood out. "I believe they made it," Chen had written. "I believe Holbrook and Morrow landed that plane, unloaded the money, crashed it deliberately, and walked away. I believe they had help, probably from at least 2 other people. I believe they left the country within a week and never returned. I believe the photograph sent to me in 2023 was genuine, and I believe they're still alive, or at least one of them is." The letter continued, "What I don't know is whether they're happy. Whether the money was worth it. Whether they ever regret it. I spent 40 years trying to catch them, and I failed. But I wonder if, in a strange way, they're prisoners too, prisoners of their own success, trapped in lives built on lies." The letter's final paragraph was the most personal. "Sometimes I dream about the case. In the dream, I'm standing at that abandoned airstrip in Pennsylvania, and I can see the plane landing. I watch them unload the money, watch them climb back into the cockpit, watch the plane take off one last time. In the dream, I know I could stop them. I could call for help, I could interfere. But I don't. I just stand there watching, and I realize I'm watching not as an investigator but as a witness to something remarkable, a perfect crime, perfectly executed. Then I wake up, and I remember that they won. They beat the system. They beat me. And you know what? Part of me, a very small part, respects that." Chen's wife read the letter twice, then carefully placed it back in its envelope and added it to the case files being donated to the archives. She thought Victoria would have wanted other investigators to see it, to understand the complexity of her feelings about the case that had defined her career. Today, the case occasionally resurfaces in true crime discussions, usually when someone discovers it for the first time and becomes fascinated by its details. Aviation safety experts sometimes reference it when discussing improvements in cargo security and tracking technology. The security protocols that failed in 1986, the minimal tracking, the vulnerable aircraft, the insufficient background checks, have long since been replaced by systems that would make such a crime nearly impossible today. But that's cold comfort to those who lived through the original investigation. The failure wasn't technological, it was human. Someone had planned this crime perfectly, anticipated every response, exploited every weakness. And they'd gotten away with it. The most recent development came in late 2024, when a researcher going through newly declassified CIA documents discovered an interesting notation in a file about American expatriates in South America. The document, dated 1989, mentioned two men matching the general descriptions of Holbrook and Morrow being observed at a yacht club in Santos, Brazil. The CIA observer had noted them because they appeared to be Americans living well beyond the means typical of retirees, but the agency had no specific reason to investigate further, and no connection was made to the Sentinel case. By the time this document was discovered, 35 years later, the information was useless. The yacht club had long since closed. The observer who'd written the report had died. Any trail that might have existed had evaporated decades ago. But the notation added weight to Chen's theory. They'd made it. They'd succeeded. And so the story remains unfinished. Somewhere, perhaps, two elderly men sit in the sun, sharing drinks and memories. Perhaps they sometimes talk about that night in 1986, the precision required, the fear mixed with exhilaration. Perhaps they've told themselves the story so many times it's become more fiction than memory, smoothed and polished by repetition. Or perhaps they never speak of it at all, having agreed long ago that the past is buried as surely as that ravine concealed the wreckage for 33 years. They would be in their 70s or 80s now, if they're still alive. The money, what's left of it, would have been carefully managed, invested wisely, used sparingly. They would have built lives, perhaps families, certainly friendships, all constructed on foundations of deception. And they would carry the knowledge that they'd pulled off something remarkable, something that would be studied and discussed long after they were gone. The only certainty is that someone knows the truth. Whether they're still alive to tell it is another question. Whether they ever will is another still. For now, the case of Sentinel Flight 227 remains what it has always been, a mystery wrapped in the clouds, a question mark hanging over the Pennsylvania mountains, reminder that sometimes the perfect crime isn't perfect because it's violent or dramatic, but because it's invisible. $7 million vanished into the sky. 2 men vanished with it. And despite decades of investigation, thousands of hours of work, and all the resources of multiple federal agencies, no one ever proved exactly what happened or who was responsible. That, in the end, is the real story, not the crime itself, but the absence of answers, the gaps in the narrative, the silence where resolution should be. The beach postcard sits in evidence storage, its message as enigmatic as the day it was discovered. Paid in full. 3 words that could mean everything or nothing. 3 words that Victoria Chen spent years analyzing, interpreting, questioning. 3 words that, perhaps, were meant as a signature, an acknowledgement that the debt to oneself, to ambition, to the idea that one could outsmart the entire system, had been satisfied. Or perhaps the words meant exactly what they said, no more and no less. Payment received. Transaction complete. Case closed, at least from the perspective of those who'd planned and executed it. For everyone else, for the investigators and the families and the curious public, the case remains forever open, a wound that never quite heals, a story that never quite ends.